Welcome to the AVRIC podcast, a space for deep reflection on violence and its aftermath, and a call to engage with the ongoing work of justice, memory, and repair. We are joined by Dr. Robyn Gill-Leslie, a postdoc at the University of Oslo, who explores how the apartheid state manufactured narratives to conceal torture and death in detention. Focusing on the case of Imam Haron, she discusses the ongoing pursuits of justice, the failures of the post-apartheid state, and how families continue to seek truth through reopened inquests and historical memory.
So what I'd like to speak about today, of those work streams that I mentioned, the one I thought would be most useful for this format is our work into Apartheid-Era medico-legal evidence. Some of you may or may not be aware that we are experiencing a resurgence in accountability for Apartheid-era crime, specifically looking at a reopening of inquest documentation from deaths in the 1960s and 70s. So the presentation that I'll be doing today is looking at the case of Imam Haron. It's the most recent judgment that's been handed down in the case of a reopened inquest. The judgment was handed down in 2023. And in case you have an interest to live follow these events, there's a reopened inquest into Chief Albert Luthuli currently happening in the KZN Pietermaritzburg court. So we'll be discussing all these developments today. So this is a picture of Imam Abdullah Haron. He was a young Muslim cleric living in Cape Town in the 1960s, and his life was cut short at the age of 45 after he was indefinitely detained in May 1969 by the Apartheid State Security Branch for alleged offences under the Terrorism Act of 1967. He survived 123 days of detention interrogation before succumbing to his injuries. The background photo is a photo of his funeral. He was found dead in his cell on the 27th of September 1969. The apartheid state claimed that the Imam had slipped and fallen down a set of stairs a few days earlier, and his heart, weakened by coronary disease, gave out based on complications from his fall. During his detention, Imam Haron was regularly interrogated about his anti-apartheid activities, and those most associated with his interrogation were security branch members Dirk Gemmers and Johannes van Wyk. Johannes van Wyk's nickname was Spyker, appellation given for his reported preference for hammering nails under the fingernails of anti-apartheid activists as an interrogation technique. And the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission collected enough evidence to associate his name with an overwhelming number of torture cases in the Western Cape. The Imam's records of his time in detention detail his decline. He was detained at the end of May. He was seen by a doctor in July for rib pain and flu-like symptoms. In September, again referred to a doctor for blood in his toilet, bleeding from the rectum that was treated as piles. Then on the 19th of September, 9 o'clock at night, after an interrogation session with Gemmers and Spyker, Imam allegedly slipped and fell down a set of stairs in the dark at the Caledon police station. After this alleged fall, the Imam complained of severe pain in his head and his chest, and records show that the captain of the Maitland police station where he was held, Captain Gelderhuys, went to his own home and administered personal medication to the Imam. Now, investigations into this medication at the Imam's reopened inquest in 2022 are inconclusive, but they suggest that this medication was in fact diloxine, which is a scheduled opioid drug related to methadone that acts like morphine. The 19th of September onwards, the Imam showed a marked decrease in appetite for exercise, moving gingerly, preferring to sit still or remain in his cell, and records show he continued to take Captain Gelderhuys' medication until he was found dead, curled in a fetal position days later, 27th of September. Imam Haron's death in custody was one of many deaths recorded from falling in detention under apartheid rule. The act of falling places a body inside a liminal space. It's a nebulous and uncertain zone precariously balanced between two stages of stability, what came before and what will come after. And the apartheid state exploited this ambiguity present in the act of falling as a facade to cover the widespread use of torture as a means of interrogation. The use of falling fictions provided a touchstone for collusion amongst policemen, doctors, prosecutors, and magistrates that allowed the security branch to get away with murder. And I think the falling fiction is a really important entry point to understanding the apartheid state machine These fantasy stories of slips and falls show how the apartheid state was performing a kind of magic, as per Veena definition of dangerous state performances. By erroneously placing deaths in detention into the bracket of accidental, the apartheid state's falling fictions kept not only the sufferer, but the families too, locked inside a liminal space, permanently caught between the commission of a crime and its resolution because there was no prospect of accountability. What's important to remember about a liminal state is that liminality was originally conceptualized and defined as a concept as a temporary space, an in-between space. Indeed, the boundless possibilities that seem to be suggested by liminal states calcify when liminality is no longer novel. Extended stays in liminal spaces can become formless and disorientating, and the feeling of being caught between two stages of stability. Tshepho Madlingozi crystallizes the reality of this state when discussing implications of transitional justice in South Africa, a country where the architecture of government has transitioned from racist minority rule. Its population remained caught in vicious cycles of poverty, violence, and exploitation. The result, writes Madlingozi, is that a liminal country, South Africa becomes a liminal country with the population who are neither on this side of the line nor really on the other. And while South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was designed to solicit disclosure of apartheid-era crime, offering amnesty from prosecution in return, this transitional justice mechanism was not designed to compel investigation and prosecution of those denied amnesty or who gave partial admissions. Concrete accountability for crimes against those like Imam Haron, whose perpetrators did not apply for amnesty, has stalled since the Commission closed its doors. After years of inaction, though, persistent family members of those who were abducted, disappeared, and tortured have seen a new wave of accountability rise in the form of reopening these decades-old inquests with a view to reverse previously fictional and damaging verdicts. In Imam Haron's case, the judge set aside the original verdict, which was a cardiac event precipitated by a fall downstairs, and ascribed it bluntly to torture. And Justice Daniel Talari was very clear. The magistrate's finding, frankly and candidly, reduced to the fact that Imam fell on his bum and had a heart attack, but count as a joke of the past 53 years, deserves to be laughed out loud if it did not cause such pain and heartache for those who sought truth. So these reopened inquests have the potential to resolve liminal spaces occupied by apartheid's murdered activists by dissolving the magical conceit of apartheid's falling fictions. By confronting these numerous fabrications relating to slips, falls, and accidents in apartheid-era detention, these cases are no longer then suspended between a barely believable fiction that serves as historical record and a truth formally denied but widely known. While a positive step forward, this doesn't address the impossibility of prosecuting perpetrators for their decades-old crimes, leaving liminal space once again between the surfacing of truth and then the impossibility of accountability for the crimes that these truths detail. The ability of the apartheid state to effectively banish accountability is reminiscent of Fernando Coronel's depiction of Venezuelan politics, where he describes the state as a sorcerer, power to replace reality with fabulous fiction. The persuasiveness of these fictive histories is the way that they depend on invisibility, in parallel with the magic show. Spectacle is weaponized to subdue questioning. Working with Coronel's depiction of a magical state, Veena highlights opacity and fiction as being hallmarks of a magical state. Das's conceptualization crystallizes state magic into four key elements: the need for magic to have a consequence from which it can be defined, the fact that for magic to be performed, it must necessarily be opaque and untransparent, the fact that magic is clearly linked to danger through the combined elements of power and obfuscation, and the fact that magic, through its mysteriousness, inherently makes the viewer or the receiver vulnerable. This metaphor of dangerous magic is an apt descriptor of how the apartheid state dealt with political activists and detainees. A bureaucratic, infrastructural machine where fictionalizing torture as a variety of accidents performed numerous functions, demonstrating the impunity of torturers to those who remained outside custody, while keeping the mechanisms of such torture secret, publicly blaming innocuous accidents. It advertised the lack of transparency in the state's legal and medical engagement with these fictive falls, in an environment where many magistrates in charge of inquests were appointed from inside the public service, not the legal sphere, and where the majority were former prosecutors with security branch experience. Developing a magical relationship between this relatively innocuous act of falling and death The apartheid state was able to weaponize this and convey a lurking sense of danger and vulnerability to survivors and family members. Because when falls against office furniture become deadly, there's a terrifying undercurrent of murky consequence for transgressing the state. I mean, I must also just highlight this table does not include deaths that were classified as jumping out of windows. So we also have the fiction of, oh, he jumped out of a window, oh, he was trying to escape. That's not even included in this. So, Ahmed Timol's not listed here. Well, Matthew's Mambalani is, because that was not a suicide, classified as a suicide or as a mistake. So, I mean, slipping on a piece of soap, injury to neck, falling against a chair, pneumonia after slipping in the shower, things that are relatively innocuous in that sense. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as I've said already, was designed to challenge and overturn the apartheid state's magic, to demarcate these lines that Chepo Madlengozi talks about on this side of the line or on that side of the line, with democracy being that divider. While this groundbreaking mechanism had many successes and it had the power to grant amnesty, it never had the power to compel investigation of abuse. That power remained entrenched inside the state, inside the National Prosecuting Authority. The state of investigation into those who were not granted amnesty at the TRC and the subsequent move towards reopening inquests as opposed to the pursuit of perpetrators for those killed aptly demonstrates this difficult and complex nature of transitional justice's operationalities in South Africa. Over the decades of its use, this concept of transitional justice has evolved and taken on a global character, demonstrating the protection of internationally enshrined rights and investigating their abuse. And yet, this implementation of transitional justice is always linked to the nation state, which implies that at its core is an acceptance as the political as part of its makeup. The danger of globalizing a discourse that remains heavily pinned to the nation state is that we risk ignoring the conjunction between state building and nation building. In thinking about the TRC, it was clear that this mechanism was required to both create and then regulate symbolic boundaries between past and present, demarcating time itself through socio-political logic. Confluence of political goals and historical truths coalesced around nation building. It was a requirement for the state to forge ahead in the wake of atrocity. But the result of this is it put some categories of life and death into the past, others into the present. But demarcating time in this manner only succeeds if the injured parties do not persist with memories of offense, forgetfulness that is not often guaranteed in post-atrocity spaces. Berber Bevernage writes about how South Africa focused on developing temporal simultaneity after the TRC, the newly democratic state relegating those who could not walk in step with the TRC's demarcation of past and present into something called allochronic time, an in-between space for those who could not conform to the TRC's socio-political logic. Inside this allochronic space were the families of those who sought criminal accountability for Apartheid-era crime. And it soon became clear that they were out of step with South Africa's governance on this issue. I'm going to unpack this a little bit, so bear with me. It's going to get technical, so just flag if I lose you with all the acronyms. The TRC's amnesty process allowed for the provision of amnesty. And of the over 7,000 applications received, over 5,000 were denied. As early as 1998, a TRC unit had been set up inside South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority. And then in 2003, when the final report was handed over, the then Priority Crimes Litigation Unit inside the NPA took charge of over 400 cases referred from the TRC. And alongside this was the prioritization of 150 missing persons reports. So included in these work streams were the cases of Nokuthula Simelane, an ANC operative abducted in 1983 and whose body was never found, and the death of Ahmed Timol, the anti-apartheid activist who died in detention in 1971. And what has happened to apartheid-era criminal accountability inside South Africa's prosecution units over the next 20 years has been unveiled slowly, primarily through court action relating to these two cases, the non-investigation of the disappearance of Nokuthula Simelane and the non-prosecution of the death of Ahmed Timol. The fact of political interference into these and all other post-TRC accountability cases has been broadly accepted by South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal and by the National Prosecuting Authority. The political interference referred to can be found in an affidavit of the ex-Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Vusi Pikoli, put forward during court proceedings relating to the Nokuthula Simelane case. Vusi Pikoli was appointed to head the NPA in 2005, suspended from office in 2007. His affidavit for the Simelane case, he claims he attempted to pursue accountability for apartheid-era crime up to the point when it came to a head in 2006. At a meeting with high-ranking officials, he was told prosecutions of apartheid-era crimes might open a door to prosecution of individuals inside the ruling ANC. And while political interference claims certainly grab headlines, it's important that we have a nuanced approach. In the 2024 report on the delays in prosecuting apartheid-era crime, written for the NPA by Advocate Dumisa Nsebeza, who was also a truth commissioner, he highlights the bureaucratic difficulties of organizing such prosecutions, assigning clear lines of responsibility, ensuring information sharing, reportage, making sure investigations are not siloed. So while political interference is a critical part of this conversation, we've got to remember that this is a bureaucratic machine as well as a political machine that needs to be functioning well. So how did we land on reopened inquests then as a route to accountability in this very complex landscape? So we go back to Nokuthula Simelane's case. Thembisile Nkadimeng, the sister of Nokuthula Simelane, contacted the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit in 2004, asking for her sister's disappearance to be investigated. 11 years later, in an affidavit relating to the non-investigation of Nokuthula Simelane's case, Advocate Anton Ackerman, who headed the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit at the time, stated the following in an affidavit during court proceedings relating to this lack of investigation. He said, "Go for an inquest." This advice to pursue inquests as opposed to prosecutions was taken up by Simelane's family along with a host of other allochronic families who've been stuck in liminal space, waiting for justice for their loved ones. The case of Imam Haron was the most recent reopened inquest with a final judgment handed down, a judgment which reverses these magical findings of a 1970s inquest and ascribes Haron's demise to the cumulative effects of physical stress resulting from. So by dissecting the fiction of a fall, apartheid state's magic begins at last to dissolve, and we have the satisfying reversal in a cycle that Alan Sekula has labeled identification, annihilation, identification. The inquest that spun the fabrication of a fall, and thereby enabled the Imam's annihilation, again provides documentation and records that can be now used to narrate a grislier story of progressive torture resulting in death. But this victory of documentation occludes how traces of apartheid state's magical fictions have embedded in the lives of survivors and family members. Family members seeking closure for apartheid-era crime have been caught in a liminal space for some families for over 5 decades. This toxic version of formless liminality has no chance of escape. For Shamila, Muhammad, and Fatima, Haron's children, there is not a single perpetrator left alive to hold accountable. And the longer-term impacts of this liminal traumas on successive generations are really significant because they're often presented with multiple versions of what happened. They can be at odds with the public historical narrative. The family narrative can be different from what the historical record says. And this can make it really difficult to carve out space to make sense of historical trauma for yourself, and why reopened inquests like the Haron case are so important. And when working on this subject matter, I'm constantly reflecting on the value and cost, persistence and repetition, because family members seeking closure for truth about apartheid-era crime really have to work, first through the TRC, subsequently with investigators, prosecutors, other organizations, through multiple inquest proceedings. And I'm left considering how families live in this strange place, hamster wheel, the in-between state, with no prospect of resolution as perpetrators die of sickness and old age. Earlier discussion framed liminal space as an in-between zone, a temporary phase. But in the case of the Haron family and countless others, that stage of resolution, that stability after change, is unachievable. Not only are perpetrators and witnesses dead, but in some cases, grieving family members too. Halima Haron, Imam Haron's wife, died in 2019 at the age of 93, not knowing what had really happened to her husband. What the Haron family and others demonstrate is that this repetitive seeking of truth, despite the impossibility of providing accountability some 50 years after the crime, can actually be seen as a rational and robust response to the inaction around accountability for past crimes. A response grounded in persistence that solidifies rather than erodes over time. And the proof is in the process. The trickle of reopened inquests into apartheid-era crime began with Thembisile Nkadimeng for his sister Nokuthula Simelane and Imtiaz Kaji, Ahmed Simel's nephew. Reopened inquests for Neil Agate, Hussein Haffajee, and Imam Haron, who were all murdered in detention, followed. 12 further cases of anti-apartheid activists' death are currently under investigation. We have Chief Albert Lutuli's inquests recently reopened in KZN. And then on the 21st of January this year, 25 co-applicants have launched a landmark constitutional damages case against numerous government and other figures in South Africa, including the president, relating to inaction and interference into the prosecution of apartheid-era crime after the conclusion of the Truth Commission. This case echoes civil society's growing calls for President Cyril Ramaphosa to launch yet another Commission of Inquiry into political interference into apartheid-era prosecution delay. Those relegated to liminal space are not accepting being consigned to socio-political history, and their continued resistance building up rather than winding down calls for a re-evaluation of allochronic. Are those survivors like the Haron family out of step with contemporary South Africa? Who are we? What made the apartheid state's magic so significant is that all of its performances and audience members knew of the fiction and yet upheld the deceit. Reopened inquests are reperforming the TRC's work and unveiling the dark and dangerous magic making at the heart of the security branches operations. Medico-legal evidence once used to deny abuse now confirms it. Historical records now reflect torture and harassment as opposed to bronchial pneumonia and cardiac arrest. In the democratic era, these inquest affidavits and related court proceedings are slowly revealing the organizational and political frailty that's kept apartheid's magic alive 30 years after its supposed dismantling. And as survivors and families implement their well-practiced persistence, it's clear that time has only heightened rather than diluted South Africans' appetite for truth recovery. And as the democratic state's inaction regarding apartheid-era prosecutions surfaces through court records, it is possible to reflect on continuities between pre- and post-democratic governance regarding accountability. The democratic state's unwillingness to pursue apartheid-era criminal accountability is a painful demonstration of the limits of transitional accountability. And yet this neglect demonstrates both the plasticity and longevity of such concerns. And this longevity calls on us to reconsider the life and death binaries of South Africa's truth recovery project and its socio-political landscape, as ghosts from 50 years ago present tangible challenges to current governance. And as this constitutional damages case will hopefully demonstrate, perhaps it is not actually the families of slain anti-apartheid activists that are out of step and indeed out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robyn. That was wonderful and very, very difficult to follow.
Don't say that.
So
I'll quiz you on the acronyms.
Yeah, no. So I mean, because one of the things I'm reading a book. It's called The Super Afrikaners at the moment, and it's about the history of the Broederbond. And I think one of the things your conversation brought up to me is they didn't have 10 commandments; they had 11, and they said that the 11th was the most important, and it was do not get caught. And one of the things I think your analysis raises is the nature of a state. And I think the way a state is capable of employing political mythology to ends that it may not even realize. So, I mean, to a certain extent, one of the things I question is to what extent did people actually believe that their fictions that they were believing were fiction? Because I feel that the apartheid system almost rested on a form of magic that in some way then enabled those forms of violence to continue and perpetuate. So there was a racialized system of hierarchy and a racialized system of danger. For example, using certain codes like Swartofar and etc., that as forms of propaganda and socialization may have really led the security forces into not being able to differentiate that clearly between truth and fiction. But so that would be my first point. But then I think the second point that you make about forgery is very correct. So I think that the sight of writing as a form of illegibility, and in Derrida's terms, that would be kind of the gap between a rule and its performance, actually creates the space for various forms of iterability and different forms of interpreting the law now within sort of the bounds of governmentality. So then my first question is, how do we differentiate between the fictions, so the opacity and the fiction of the apartheid state, and then a focus on documentation that actually looks at forgery as a real problem?
Sure. Well, I think the first one is a really interesting one because I think there's a lot of, in perhaps popular consciousness and popular understanding, the security, and even I slipped into it in my talk also, we think about the security branch, and then we kind of forget that the security branch was one form of governance. We're talking about the collusion between medical, legal, and it's not just deugnis and Spyker van Wyk. It's also, in fact, that Imam Haron's reopened inquest, the one police member that was still alive who dealt with his custody was the guy who opened and closed the door to the police station. It's him too. And even at that stage, in 2023, he was unable to acknowledge his role. He was like, oh, but I didn't see anything, but I felt really bad for so many years, but I didn't really do anything. But it's been heavy on my heart. It's been weighing on me, but I didn't see anything. But, even he was unable to resolve these paradoxical, there's no blood on my hands, and yet I carry a guilt. So I think that's a really critical thing to highlight, is that apartheid was infrastructural. I mean, we know that, but that was at the key definition of the word. It created an architecture from which you could not escape. And I think we as a country have a duty to give the security branch their due, but then to pursue the other bureaucratic aspects of culpability. I thought, we discussed this yesterday, the fact that there isn't a single medical practitioner who has received a sanction for Apartheid-era crime. There isn't a single the business hearings of the TRC were not attended by the majority of businesses who had financial and loan relationships with the apartheid state. We're talking about infrastructure that wasn't really interrogated in that same way. And in fact, at the end of the inquest, Justice Daniel Tulare referred all of the forensic pathologists that signed off on Imam Haron's inquest to the Medical and Dental Association, but they're all dead. So, we do need to consider how the bureaucracy of apartheid was culpable in the same way. And I think what's also interesting in terms of how people believe or don't believe in the fiction that's being spun, if you read the inquest documents, it's never a case of the Imam Haron had coronary disease and died of a heart attack. It's classic balance of probabilities. They're like, oh, he had a weakened heart. For the Imam Haron inquest, they said that because he was Muslim, his habit of crouching for prayer could have led to an obstruction, a venous obstruction, like a blood clot in his legs, that then could have given him an aneurysm, and then he died. And these are forensic pathologists, who've gone to medical school, canvassing these absurd fictions, but, writing it down, this is a probability, that's a probability, So it's never that, and that's what makes it believable, is because they're not saying, oh, Imam Haron died of this. They're saying, well, there was this, and then there was that, and then he fell down the stairs. And they're building this believability through probability rather than believability. Because if you looked at, Prof. Steve Naidu, the very eminent forensic pathologist who redid Imam Haron's inquest, along with Prof. Itumeleng Molefe from UCT, it was unequivocal. It was complete nonsense. They were dismayed and outraged. But that's because they were looking at it from a 2022 perspective. Whereas back in the day, they were looking at it from a, how can we spin this so we don't get into trouble with our bosses who are trying to get us to do this and that? And you can read the reports of the medical practitioners who then were with Imam Haron before he died. So throughout his detention, he was seen repeatedly. And the medical reports that they write, Doctors Schoen, I think, and Dr. Rudolph, it's in the inquest, they all say that what the Imam reported to them with Spyker and Ginnis behind his shoulders, or the Imam told me that, yes, he has suffered from piles before, so I gave him a suppository. And, the elephant in the room is the fact that this isn't happening in a vacuum. So I think that's where this belief, this banality, the banality of evil is an overused phrase, but that's what it is. That's why these became so convincing in a way, is because it was this probability. And what's also interesting is when I interviewed a few people who did know the doctors who performed this autopsy, even they were reluctant to criticize them. Even though Dr. Schwa, who performed the autopsy, went on literally to write the book on forensic medicine, chapter 9, what to do when there is a death in detention, steps he wrote, but did not follow 1960. So there's this really paradoxical inability to confront complicity, which I think is a huge part of the accountability gap. Sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
No, I think this is great. I just have another comment, but does anyone have any questions? Because I think we can return to me. Thabo Wetu?
Unlike Dr. Naika. I thoroughly enjoyed.
Thank you for the validation.
I would have sat here 2 hours because I think there's a threading of concepts that I thoroughly enjoyed, right? And one of them is time, the idea of time, and how the fiber of time within certain systems can be captured in a particular way and misused in a particular way to follow certain narrative. How time, in and of itself, in moments like that, doesn't become an objective construct, but becomes, it's subjected to certain craftings of collective subjectivity, right? And I was thinking a lot when you were speaking about wolves, and all of that, and I think about the work of Umbuso Nkosi, who writes a book called These Potatoes Look Like Hair, and
That work well.
right, and the idea of this idea of death, and this idea of violence. And there's a part there where he writes about the futurity of violence, that violence does not enact itself solely for the now, but violence enacts itself in the now to enable the future to still, work within that ambit of violence, right? And you speak about that policeman who's facing that paradox. It's that thing at play, right? Like, but I'm still given to that sensibility. I can't say what happened because I'm giving up certain things and all of that. And so I think you're calling us to that kind of critical engagement and critical thinking about the futurity of violence, right? And in my own thinking about that, to counter that idea, I was like, if there's a futurity of violence, there's a futurity of imagination that has been historicized as past. And so again, going back to what you said about how sometimes certain things can be historicized as past, and so we can't go back to them. But certain people live with those as a reality, right? And that can enable us to engage with imagination in the present, to kind of think about ways to continue to think about healing in a way, Last thing, I'm also thinking about in Umbuso Nkosi's book about the healer,
Chanelo.
Yes, who has this vision of these bodies, but goes to the MEC, and the MEC, the first thing is like, nah, this can't be true. But she insists because those things then start to imprint themselves on her body until they find those bodies, And again, it goes back to your point of what we see as evidence and what we've been taught to see as evidence,
Exactly that. And I found Gogom Shanelo's case fascinating. Just for the room, Gogom Shanelo is a seer from KZN, from Pietermaritzburg, who had a vision of 100 ghosts, dead bodies, burning in great pain, like clamoring for rest and peace. And working with another healer, she eventually found her way to a sugarcane farm miles away from Maritzburg, South Coast, Dududu, South Coast KZN. And she said she instantly recognized the site of her vision because what she'd thought of in her vision as a dam, like a large dark object, was in fact a cell block where they used to keep farm laborers who were bought for 5 cents at the Durban Magistrates Court for pass offences. So when they dug, they called the Missing Persons Task Force, which is a TRC legacy project. They dug for 3 days. They didn't find the bodies. Now, I'm fascinated by this case. Sorry, it's unrelated to Imam Haron, but I'm fascinated by this case because what we have is what happens when we remove that hypervisuality of a physical bone. So we have the vision. We know that the sugarcane farm was the site of multiple layers of endemic violence, abuse against bodies. And yet, when we dig, we don't find. What does that reveal? What does it tell us when we take away that hypervisual trauma? When that trauma is only existent in someone's imagination and in the physical manifestations of those visions on one person. Gogom Shanelo said her teeth fell out. She stopped being able to speak because she was being so oppressed upon by this vision. And I think that's another fascinating example of the futurity of violence. If the ghosts of the past can return in this way to reenact and to claim their accountability, in what ways we dealing with that as a country? And in fact, Gogo Mshanelo has written, she was interviewed, you can find it online, I think it's in one of the Durban papers, like the Mercury or something, where she says, until we have a nationwide cleansing project, these ghosts will continue to haunt us. And yeah, that's a powerful perspective indeed. And in many ways, I know Imam Haron isn't within the same sort of cultural framework or the same, his vision, his death is not enactioned in the same way as through Gogo Mshanelo. But in many ways, his ghost haunts his family too. I mean, what I find so compelling about these cases is, again, the infrastructures of abuse are still there. So Fatima and Muhammad were able to return to the Caledon police station and walk that staircase that he supposedly fell down. There are really these affectual moments of interacting with history that bring it straight back to the past. It's a haunting, much in the same way as Gogo Mshanelo is being haunted. And I think we don't consider that spectral aspect of the past in the same way. I was saying to Veena yesterday, I don't consider South Africa as a country that has history, because everything is here all the time. We don't have history in that way.
Apartheid remains in its remains.
The magical states, yeah.
Or just living history. I mean, there's a difference, it seems to me, between a haunting, which evokes images of ghosts. But here, I think we have to move beyond ghosts. It's not ghostly, it's real. It's a living history. It's stuff that you are living with, which is why I really struggle with the language of ghosts. I mean, I see its place, but I think also it locks us in the idea of something invisible, something not there, the language of ghosts. When we revisited, part of the reason we wanted you to come is really to help us to think about how might we think of a research project ourselves that focuses on bodies that are not found, the remains that are or the partial remains. I mean, there's so many stories in South Africa, unfinished stories, because people can't mourn, and then it's not just the generation of the people who lived the traumas, but it's a transgenerational impact of it. I mean, I really like your what you brought up, and what I would like to go beyond is, how do we find a way of focusing on precisely these issues of how, almost like the TRC was a staging of a future of violence. It was already itself a staging, a kind of a prophetic moment that stages the violence to come. And how do we look at all of these concepts as sites of research for our center, because it is about reclaiming the stories that will actually enable us to heal, to take that process of engaging with these pasts that are still present with us as a way of reimagining a future that is different from the past. And to use that use bodies, unfound bones, or remains that are partial. I mean, I remember the Mamelodi 10 were so, in a way, partially relieved because, we had them at UCT, and one of the wives was talking about, at least I found one bone. It was one bone that could be identified as in terms of DNA, as a bone belonging to their loved ones. And she said, at least I found a bone. At least I've got something to bury. And those people who can't mourn and conclude the process of mourning because there is no body. What do you do when there is no body? So this country is a country where we have all these stories, the unfinished stories that required. This was in the Mercury, that story you're talking about. It was in the Mercury. And it was a powerful story because it called us to the place of what remains to be done after all these stories, and it isn't individual stories. They represent so much. It might be Nokutula's mother, who, by the way, traveled to all the places where the ANC, she went to Botswana, to Lesotho, to Angola, 30 years after, thinking that, according to her, I've not found my daughter's remains. Maybe she went mad somewhere. She literally traveled, to all of these sites where the ANC had camps. looking for, when the ANC came back in 1990, daughter was not there. She went on a hunt, going to all, and not flying by taxi to most of these places, by bus, by taxi, because she said, my daughter may have gone mad and she does not know where she is. Still hoping that her daughter is still alive. And can you imagine what that means? And Noktula's mother is still alive. She's still broken, and how many of them, people like that, are living with that kind of future of an unfinished, what remains for us, the way of journeying towards healing.
Thank you. Build a little bit on what Prof said and then come to what the question. So this notion of the finding of the bodies in the Rwandan context, as we've talked about a lot, Robyn, that's at its best, that's how Gachacha was articulated. It was articulated, what did it do? It provided some information about location of bodies in particular. But I wonder, the question I have is about the labor of that, of finding those bodies and identifying them. Because, Robyn, your accounts here it's the families that's doing that labor and the traveling. And Francesca Lesser has the same work around disappearances in Latin America, and it's the families who are then pursuing these cases in courts in Italy. And in my own work now, we see survivor groups in France who are pushing for the continuation of criminal cases against Rwandan nationals in France. So the labor is being done by the families. And then I wonder how that sits up against some other. So there's a question of who should be doing this work and who is doing this work. But the other side of that question is also is a question around Leila Ulrich has done some work on the ICC where she makes a labor critique of the ICC of saying, look, the victims are doing all this laboring for what is ultimately an international justice project that's reinforcing particular types of, in her account, capitalist relationships. And so her move then is an abolitionist move. Her move is to say we should be moving away from criminal accountability. Now, so the tension for me is, how do we see this abolitionist move, which is a critique of this laboring of the victim, in the context of that labor being done, what you articulate really as a labor of love or as dedication or as haunting. And I just, in transitional justice at the moment, I experience that real tension between the victims claiming this continued justice seeking and this move of an abolitionist move that actually criminal justice is not the mechanism to be doing this.
I have thoughts on that, actually, because it's something that I've been quite consumed by, actually, is trying to understand what motivates the families. Of course, it's truth and justice and all that, but knowing that there isn't a single perpetrator that can be held to account. So criminal accountability is off the table, and yet we pursue it still.
Sorry.
So what does that really mean? And I'm questioning, why do we have a mindset where we turn to the law to fix us? And I find that really interesting. And I don't have an answer for it, but we were discussing it yesterday, considering that the Apartheid project was a legal one at its heart. From before 1913, of course, but from 1913, from 1941, 1952, 1953, these were legal projects that created these sites of, and potentially we have not yet escaped from that kind of apartheid magical state, is that we still turn to the law to fix us. Like the Marikana Commission of Inquiry was an intensely legalistic process that boiled down to a case of self-defense or not, when in fact it was a much bigger, broader, complex question than simply a legal framing. The inquests are an incredibly legalistic process. They require a judge, they require a lawyer. They take years. Imam Haron's took 18 months, I think, and that was a quick one. So why do we turn to the law? What does it give us? What work does it do for us? I can't answer it. And are we still are we stuck in the trappings of colonial idea of what constitutes as right and wrong, what constitutes visible and invisible? And how do we escape that? Because acknowledging that would mean dropping these accountability cases. And where does that sit with repair, piecing together your fragmentary personal and historical timeline? You don't have that external validation from an inquest document. It puts the work on you again, just in a different way. So maybe there is no escape.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder if there's a third way, like between the abolitionism and between expecting so much from the actual direct connected survivors and victims. And it is linked to, I think, how we struggle to make sense of the TRC. And specifically the question of where does justice fit into that picture. And I remember many, many hours, and I was part of that team working on some of those attempts to find some kind of moral conceptual framework for the TRC. And this idea of accountable amnesty. It's not blanket amnesty. And then Archbishop Tutu's language of restorative justice, not retributive justice. So I think this conversation does go back to our struggles within the TRC to say also we need to find ways to share responsibility with the wider society. So that volume 4 of the TRC report that goes into the institutional hearings was really almost too late in the process because it's something people have forgotten. But it was really a very serious grappling with this question. How do we bring the faith communities, the media, the business community, the judiciary, the health sector, like you just name it, like this kind of wider understanding of how did these individual events happen and who shares responsibility morally and politically, perhaps not legally, but in a very real sense for repair. And so almost like we're back at some of those, or revisiting, I think, some of the really challenging questions. And at the moment, we are grappling with that kind of question, even in this institutional context, to say, is it possible for us to understand transgenerational historical responsibility for descendants of beneficiaries, of implicated subjects, beyond the victim-perpetrator paradigm, but not denying the role of that paradigm. So to move away from the individualistic and the legalistic, but to include that in a wider grappling with shared historical responsibility. I think it's such a critical question, and I'm speaking from the point of view of the implicated, the complicit, but also with the generational awareness and the limits of language around crime and accountability, I think is a big part of our challenge. So thank you for it's not a question, I suppose, it's just a comment.
Absolutely, and I think it's that exact, everything you've just said just gets distilled down into that single man sitting in Imam Haron's inquest, just physically unable to acknowledge those two characters that he holds, one of guilt and shame and complicity, and one of guilt of not feeling guilty. He holds those two characters. I did nothing, but I did everything. How do I resolve that? And it's
what I think about, what bothers me, speaking about the TRC, is that the Haron family never ended up going to the TRC or participating in the TRC. And yet years later, they were motivated, inspired by Ahmad Tamal's inquest, and then decided to reopen the inquest. I believe they never went to the TRC because the wife of Imam Haron didn't think she'll get any closure, that she didn't believe in the TRC. So like years later, and now we see a trend in this reopening of inquests. But yeah, I would love to know exactly the family ever really participated in the TRC.
I'm not sure about the specifics, but I do know that the TRC did investigate Imam Haron's death. And the statement that they made at the time said Imam Haron, I'm paraphrasing here, most probably died from torture, and this is a quote, the TRC is unable to overturn a previous inquest verdict. So the idea was that, again, it's like, we all know what happened here, but because that's not our role. Our job is criminal accountability in this way is not our role. So they did say, there's a really useful website, a Truth Commission special report, where you can search through, every single TRC document. And if you put Imam Haron in there, it will come. It is studying Imam Haron, yes. I thought that might be the case. And they do have that little paragraph in there. So it was investigated. Why the family did not go to the TRC, I could not say. I think it would feel wrong to even speculate on that. But I think there's a lot to be said for the work done by Nokuthula Simelani's family and Imtiaz Kwaji, Ahmed Timos's family, who really kickstarted this idea of we are not done here.
Thanks so much. I was just thinking about the sort of question on, to put it very simply, like giving up on law. And it's sort of thinking of it almost like a conversation with the past and a way of kind of building into the future. If we're not a legal expert whatsoever, my scholarship has got nothing to do with law, but if I sort of think of it in my mind, it's almost like a kind of social infrastructure. And I think also of the like national legal system with regards to the genocide, and that idea of like, what does it mean to bring a genocide case forward in a context where it's so rigged, and so likely to be slammed. And but is it really about a kind of possible quest towards humanizing these infrastructures, and can we really afford to give up on that, even if it seems so rigged, and yet what can one get out of it? And I'm thinking there similarly about medicine or science, or in my field, museums, any of these kind of long-lasting structures. Isn't that effort of kind of always going back into them with these cases, which can be addressed in these myriad other ways, which might be more powerful and meaningful, but isn't that conversation sort of
absolutely? And it's so interesting,
changing the law itself.
And you say that, and it's so true, because we get caught up in the legal performance being the thing, but actually it's what's happening inside that infrastructure that's important. When you were speaking, it just reminded me of the fact that Imam Haron at the reopened inquest, I don't want to get names wrong here, but there's an anti-apartheid activist who was detained with her child, who was just 18 months old at the time, and she named her child Haroon. Shirley Gunn. I wanted to say that, but I wasn't sure. So Haroon Gunn, I guess.
Sally.
Yes. So he is now an artist, and he created these bodily images of the Imam to then present at the inquest. So you had this crazy intergenerational exposure between a child named after an activist who was born into a site of that kind of very personal violence against his family. You have an inquest magistrate who's actively, ascribing torture. We have a personal family. You have Muhammad. And they all interact in this, Howard Barney, who's been working on TRC matters for so long, and they all come together. And perhaps that's what law's job is. It's not actually the verdict. It's the way in which it can conjoin these multiple narratives, these multiple experiences, and create that moment of, for me, I love affect theory, that moment of affect, how we are touched by what we can see and feel. And that's what law does. As you say, that conversation of attempts at repair, of really, so almost law is just providing the forum for it.
But the arts also stepping in to animate that conversation, and the arts being, in another narrative, to animate the conversation.
So one more question.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much. This was such an intriguing and necessary presentation. I really enjoyed your presentation style. You made a comment during the Q&A on South Africa being a country without history.
Sorry, that was a bit.
But even though it's flippant, I think it's still a very, not just provocative, but poignant statement, because you're speaking about the present past. And in that, my initial question was about your usage of falling, not just as a justification for someone's death, but as the imagery of falling. And doing that from South Africa's past, for instance, when we think about apartheid, it's considered as this all-encompassing, overpowering system. But the mere siloed fact, like the fact that the apartheid system was so siloed, speaks about how that system was constantly in the making, constantly reshaping, and never sure about itself. And it's evidenced over time, because apartheid of the 60s is not apartheid of the 80s, is not apartheid of the 20s. for the 20s, because then you're even speaking about a different system of segregation for pre-apartheid, which inherits a large colonial complicated history. So I really want you to speak to that falling, not just necessarily at the way that the table, incredible. I really liked your usage of the imagery of falling, but also as a means to understand that the state that we are in post-1994, in that system of suspense.
Yes.
So I'm very curious about that.
And I think that's, in a nutshell, actually, that's how I see these documents, these documentary artifacts as demonstrating. I feel like, documentation of apartheid's atrocities are suspended in time because they can be called upon at any point to create narratives of widely differing outcomes. And I guess that's the Madlangozi quote that I used about this idea of South Africa being a liminal country, is that exact thing. We are in a state of suspension between cyclicality and teleological governance moving on and cyclicality continuing. And the resolution of that's the key, if we can find the lock. But I do find that state of suspension a really compelling framework. And I find it with Marikana too. When you look at the medico-legal reports from the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, these medico-legal documents, which many lawyers will tell you at the commission, actually were quite irrelevant to the commission because they had so much photographic and video evidence to wade through. The actual physical documents where the body is laid out and marked, as Haron's body was marked. But the people had most relevance to were the families who said, no, I want to keep it. Give me that autopsy pack. I want to take it home. It forms part of my family's history now. And that report will be called upon when a child is born in this family and takes his father's name. That report must be called upon to be dealt with so that the child does not inherit bad death that occurred in my family. And so these reports also suspended in time will be called upon and have been called upon in the past, will be called upon in the future, form part of now a generational touchstone. And yet are suspended about their prescient. As I think you said the words, the prophet, the TRC is prophesying. In many ways, these medico-legal documentations are prophesying constantly too, from Imam Haron's report. So why do we take better care of them? These documents are critical. So yeah, for me, that state of suspension really plays out in found artifactual documentary evidence that plays this incredible role in the way we interrogate our past and our future.
Thank you for listening to the AVRIC podcast. For more insights, research, and reflections, visit our website or follow us online and join the reparative journey.